Reform is usually imagined as deliberate, a careful correction, a steady hand placed on a system that has drifted too far from its original purpose. But history offers a quieter contradiction. Sometimes reform does not stabilize power. Sometimes it dissolves it. And often, the moment that looks like renewal is the moment control begins to slip. Mikhail Gorbachev is often remembered as a reformer who miscalculated, a leader who opened doors he could not later close. But that framing assumes power behaves like an object, something that can be adjusted without changing its nature. This inquiry begins from a different place. It asks what happens when authority depends not on force alone, but on belief, ritual, and restraint. And what occurs when those foundations are disturbed by the very person trying to preserve them. The period in question is the final decade of the Soviet Union, a vast state marked by rigid structures, inherited certainties, and carefully managed silence. Gorbachev did not arrive as a revolutionary outsider. He rose through the existing order. He understood its language. He believed it could be renewed rather than replaced. His project was not collapse, but continuity through reform. What he encountered was a pattern older than the state itself. Power, especially centralized power, often relies on limits that are not openly acknowledged. Certain questions are not asked. Certain contradictions are managed through distance or delay. Stability depends less on truth than on coherence. As long as the story holds, authority feels intact. Gorbachev introduced reforms that were meant to strengthen that coherence. Glasnost allowed greater openness. Perestroika aimed to restructure economic life. These were not framed as admissions of failure, but as adjustments. The assumption was that power could tolerate more visibility without losing its center. But visibility changes more than information. It changes perception. And perception, once altered, is difficult to contain. As openness increased, so did uncertainty, not only among citizens, but within the institutions themselves. Officials accustomed to fixed narratives found themselves navigating ambiguity. Rules that once felt absolute became negotiable. The system began to reveal its own seams. This is where reform encounters a paradox. Power systems often survive by appearing inevitable. When reform exposes contingency, when it suggests that things could have been otherwise, it weakens the sense of necessity. Authority becomes one option among others, rather than the only imaginable framework. Gorbachev did not remove power directly. He loosened its grip on meaning. Across history, similar moments recur. Rulers attempt to modernize aging structures, without dismantling them. They introduce flexibility where rigidity once prevailed. Often they believe restraint can be selectively applied, that openness can be managed. But restraint is not easily partitioned. Once speech is permitted, it spreads unevenly. Once criticism is allowed, it rarely remains polite. The act of reform signals vulnerability, even when strength is intended. It suggests that the existing order is no longer complete in itself. In the Soviet case, reform did not simply alter policy. It changed the rhythm of expectation. Citizens began to imagine futures that were not prescribed. Regions began to articulate identities that had been submerged. The center remained, but its authority felt less absolute. Control, in this sense, was not seized from Gorbachev. It eroded. There is a tendency to attribute this erosion to external pressure or economic strain. These factors mattered, but they do not fully explain the speed or direction of the unraveling. What shifted was not only material conditions, but the relationship between authority and belief. Power endures when it feels aligned with inevitability, when its continuation appears natural rather than enforced. Reform, paradoxically, can disrupt that alignment by acknowledging choice. Gorbachev's language mattered. He spoke of renewal, transparency, shared responsibility. These words implied participation. they reduced the distance between ruler and ruled. But that distance had been part of the structure. It insulated authority from immediate accountability. As the distance narrowed, so did the margin for control. Ancient political thought often warns that rulers who reform must decide whether they are correcting excess or redefining legitimacy. The two are not the same. Correction preserves the frame. Redefinition invites comparison. Once people compare, they evaluate. Once they evaluate, they judge. Gorbachev did not intend to redefine legitimacy, yet his reforms allowed it to be questioned, not violently at first, quietly, through discussion, through memory, through the re-emergence of suppressed histories. Power, when subjected to sustained questioning, does not collapse all at once. It fragments. Different parts respond differently. Some resist, some adapt, some detach. This fragmentation was visible in the late Soviet years. Authority remained at the top, but coherence below it thinned. Institutions followed old rules while acknowledging new realities. The result was drift rather than command. What is striking is that Gorbachev did not respond by tightening control. He believed reversal would destroy credibility. He chose consistency over coercion. In doing so, he revealed another limit of reform. Once openness becomes part of legitimacy, closing it feels like betrayal. This is the bind reformers often face. To preserve trust, they must continue. To preserve control, they must stop. Both choices carry consequence. History shows that power rarely survives the exposure of its own scaffolding. Once people see how authority is maintained through habits, rituals, silences, it becomes harder to accept it as natural. Reform illuminates what was meant to remain unseen. The Soviet system had long relied on managed certainty. Its narratives were not always believed, but they were familiar. Familiarity creates tolerance. Reform replaced familiarity with uncertainty, and uncertainty invites alternatives. This does not mean collapse was inevitable, but it does suggest that reform altered the conditions under which power could function. Control was not lost in a moment. It was redistributed into uncertainty. Other rulers have faced similar moments. Some chose repression, some chose retreat. Gorbachev chose continuation. He believed the system could evolve without losing itself. The question is whether power systems built on closure can survive openness at all. In this sense, Gorbachev's story is less about failure and more about exposure. He revealed that the authority he inherited depended on constraints that could not be selectively removed. Once loosened, they did not return to their original shape. Reform did not create opposition. It clarified it. As structures weakened, expectations accelerated. The pace of change exceeded the capacity for coordination. Control requires tempo. When events move faster than decision-making, authority lags behind reality. By the time Gorbachev recognized the depth of the shift, the center could no longer reassert coherence without abandoning the very principles that justified reform. The moral cost of reversal felt higher than the political cost of loss. Here, the inquiry turns inward. If power depends on belief, and belief depends on consistency, what happens when leaders attempt to correct systems without acknowledging how much control rests on illusion? When reform is pursued without confronting the fragility it reveals? Is power something that can be redesigned from within, or does the act of redesign announce its limits? Gorbachev's legacy remains contested. To some, he is the leader who ended an era peacefully. To others, the one who let it slip away. Both views assume power is an object that can be held or dropped. But power may be closer to a balance than a possession, something maintained through restraint, timing, and shared assumptions. Once those assumptions shift, control becomes a memory rather than a mechanism. The pattern is ancient. Reformers open systems believing they can guide the flow. They discover that movement has its own direction. That once meaning changes, authority must either transform completely or dissolve. Gorbachev stood at that threshold. He chose not to retreat. He chose not to harden. He allowed the pattern to unfold. Whether this was loss or inevitability depends on how one understands power itself, and that question remains unsettled. Because if control cannot survive its own reform, then power is less stable than it appears, and every attempt to renew it carries the risk of revealing how provisional it always was. The silence that follows collapse is often mistaken for absence, but it may be something else, the echo of a structure that depended on not being fully seen, and once seen, could not be unseen again. Subscribe to Timeless Questions to explore how history and human nature quietly shape us.